My name is Paul Ryer. I'm the Director of Scholar Programs here at SAR, and it is my great pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Dr. Pierrette Hondagneu-Sotelo. Pierrette was a fellow here when I first arrived at SAR some years ago, and she actually wrote a lot of the book that we're going to be hearing about while she was here. So it is a double pleasure to welcome her back and to hear about the next stages of this beautiful project that she's been working on. Dr. Hondagneu-Sotelo is the Florence Everline Professor of Sociology in the Department of Sociology at the University of Southern California. She has her PhD from University of California, Berkeley. She's the author of 9 books, so I won't be able to list them all, but most recently, including the one she'll talk about today, South Central Dreams, Finding Home and Building Community in South Los Angeles, NYU Press, and that is co-authored by Manuel, published this year. Again, many more books as well, and too many book chapters and journal articles and honors in the field of sociology to mention. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Pierrette Hondagneu-Sotelo. She'll give a presentation and then we will have Q&A afterward.
Gosh, well, thank you very much for that nice introduction, Paul. And thank you to Ashley for all the technical help, although right now my camera video seems to have cut out, but I apologize for that, and I'm afraid to unplug it because I may just become entirely unplugged from all of you at that moment. So I think I'm just going to begin with, I have a PowerPoint presentation to share with you, and really this is going to be a lot of storytelling. So let me just see if I can share the screen and we can go to that.
Perfect. I'm going to mute myself now and let you take it away.
Okay, and again, my apologies. It's my, I don't know, I have a funky technical system here, but you know, thank you. It's really a great pleasure to be here. I'm grateful to SAR for inviting me to do this book talk. And it does feel like full circle because it was in fall 2017 that I inhabited a beautiful little office at SAR besides a huge apricot tree. I had never seen an apricot tree the size of an oak tree. And I was able to watch it change throughout the seasons. And as we went from fall to spring, I was able to not only write, but really work through mounds of transcripts. If any of you are qualitative sociologists or anthropologists, you know that after you have field notes or interview transcripts, you just have mounds of narrative to work through. So it's so important to have time to really read and think and analyze. So thank you to SAR for that. I am a co-author of this new book, South Central Dreams, with Manuel, who's my colleague at USC. And our names, you know, appear on the book jacket, but really this is an incredible team research effort. We were based in what was then called the USC Center for the Study of Immigrant Integration, which Manuel directs and which I was associate director of. And Manuel and I started conceiving of this project in 2014 when community leaders asked us to do this. They wanted somebody to come and really tell the right story. And I'll tell about South LA, and I'll go into some detail about the narratives that had prevailed. And we put together a really wonderful team that included graduate student RAs, staff who were at the Center for the Study of Immigrant Integration, now called the Equity Research Institute. These are permanent researcher staff many of whom are very well versed in quantitative data analysis, but not qualitative, which is part of what I brought to the table. And just an amazing group of very talented people helped us, including Walter Thompson Hernandez, who went on to become a videographer, journalist at the New York Times. He then wrote the best-selling book Compton Cowboys, and did a podcast called California Love. Our postdoc, Veronica Montes, who had just received her PhD and is now a tenured professor at Bryn Mawr. So I can't name them all, but just give you a sense that there was a lot of collective effort that went into this multi-methods project. What do we do in this project? I mean, basically what we're trying to answer in this book is, what does it mean now that South LA has a majority of Latino residents? This was a historically important African-American neighborhood. Mexican and Central American immigrants came here in great numbers, especially in the 1980s and 1990s. And made homes for themselves, found a place of belonging. So what does that mean when a Latino group comes into a Black space? How did it happen? What are people's experiences, identities? What are the consequences going forward? South LA was 80% African American in 1970, and it's majority Latino today. So in many ways, it's transformed from being what we might have called an inner city Black neighborhood to a new kind of Latino barrio. So we're interested in both the people and the place. And one of our major findings is detecting a new kind of Latinidad in South LA. Our research questions are very straightforward. You know, how did this process happen? How did Latino immigrants make themselves at home? Why did they come here? What were their experiences? But we're really interested in looking at this process across generations. So we deliberately sampled our interviewees. So we captured first generation immigrants and second generation Latinos who were raised in places like Watts and historic South Central. And we also want to follow this over time. What are, the consequences? And there's there's a lot of different moving parts to this book. I'm not going to talk about it all today, but some of you who know me know that I am very transfixed, let us say, by gardens and parks and plant life. And Los Angeles, you may know, is among the most park-poor big cities in the United States, and in neighborhoods and Black and Latino neighborhoods, there's a real scarcity of green spaces. So I developed a side project looking at urban community gardens in Watts and several different public parks. And we also looked at civic life, civic leaders, because we find there's a lot of very hopeful progressive coalition building that really could be modeled elsewhere. That said, and I'll go over what our methods were in a moment. I want to offer that I believe our research was, as rigorous as we could make it, as careful, but like all research, it's partial and incomplete. And just like when you go to the buffet table, our eyes were bigger at the outset. We thought we could do more things. And I would offer this as an invitation to the next generation of researchers. There's so many topics worthy of a deep dive analysis in South LA. One of them is real estate. So I'm going to go to, right now you're looking at a photo that Walter Thompson Hernandez took, and you can see there's a lot of beautiful housing stock, in my estimation. These old craftsman houses with beautifully tended gardens are a real asset. But you will notice bars around the windows, bars on the doors, sometimes elaborate porch cages surrounding the porches. Like, what's happening with real estate transactions? This is an ongoing story that I can speak to a little bit, but was not the focus of our project. Entrepreneurship, lots of interest in this. New cafes, restaurants, small shops. For a while, our postdoc, Veronica Montes, was going to do a study of this one avenue in historic Central. It's called Historic Central Avenue, which you may have read about, was basically LA's version of Harlem, right? There was the Dunbar Jazz Hotel, famous churches. Whenever Martin Luther King came to LA, he preached there. When all the jazz greats came, they performed there. Today, that strip is full of panaderias, quinceañera shops. It's all small Latino immigrant barber shops and marquetas and so on. But there's still a lively music scene going on. It's just diversified. So we have gone from Charles Mingus to Kamasi Washington, but also there's a Latino punk ska culture. There are drum circles. Again, just giving you an idea of the wider array of life here. Okay, what were the kinds of methods we used? What's the data we used? As I said, it's a mixed methods project, and Manuel and his team, primarily with Pamela Stevens, were in charge of the quantitative data. We didn't have the kind of resources you really need to go out and do a brand new survey, but we relied primarily on US Census data, mapping these into what the LA Times Mapping Project has done to look at particular neighborhoods. And then I'm going to not really focus too much today on our quantitative data, but I am going to show you some very striking maps of racial and social demographic change that come out of this. The qualitative data was what I oversaw. And it's primarily an interview study with some ethnography at these large urban community gardens in Watts and in a couple of public parks. But really, I think the heart of the book is its 100, and we did close to 200 interviews, but the 100 in-depth interviews that we did with first and second generation Latino residents is really the core of this. So we started out to tell the Latino story of South LA, but what happens as you do this is you realize, oh, you can't really tell the Latino story without telling the African American story. There is an important book, a precursor to ours, called Black Los Angeles by Darnell Hunt and Christina Ramon, that does already address this gap. I think there's more to be revealed. These 100 first and second generation interviews that we conducted were centered in 3 particular neighborhoods of South LA. When I put these maps up on the screen, you'll see that South LA is a very large region. It's a mega neighborhood. It's a city in its own right. It has a population of 850,000, which is bigger than Albuquerque, Las Cruces, and Santa Fe combined. So, and each within this mega neighborhood, there are particular areas. So we chose Watts, which is where this photograph was shot. I'll speak to this in a moment. We chose Watts, which I think is probably most famously known for the Watts riots or the Watts rebellions of 1965. Watts has a kind of rural quality to it. I think Watts stands in as kind of a quintessential inner city American neighborhood, but honestly, well, as you see here in this photograph, which is stretches this garden, Stanford Avalon Community Garden, which comes out of the old South Central Farms, stretches over 9 acres, 203 huge plots are farmed here. And the plots are not our small little raised beds that we might have in our suburban backyards, but 1,500, 1,800 square foot plots that are mostly farmed by Latino immigrant men. All of these parks and gardens have political origins to them. I'm not, as I said, I'm not really going to dwell on that chapter here today, but if you want to ask questions in the discussion or the chat afterwards, I'm happy to answer it. They're real male spaces, which was a surprise to me. There's still sort of a lingering fear factor. I think there's a lot of things that keep women out of public space, but a kind of a lingering fear factor is one of them. This photo is one of my interviewees and one of my friends. I'm just going to call him Paulo today. He's bilingual, which is, but he doesn't speak English. He's bilingual in Spanish and Quiche, his Mayan language. And although he is undocumented, and although he works these tireless hours at this sort of like a hardware store site, he's a big community leader. He was elected as one of the representatives at the garden. He's been on the LA Neighborhood Council. He started a boxing gym for youth. But that said, I will give you a little preview. And one of our findings in terms of civic life is that for Latino immigrants, it's one of the weakest links. Immigrant integration, there's various registers of it, but I would say civic life remains among the weakest. And I have accompanied Paulo to City Hall. I have intervened, and I can speak more to why that happens. Our project, we're sociologists, but our project isn't just about reporting data. It is that we're trying to get the story right, but we're also trying to innovate theoretical frameworks, right? Which are sort of like the lens for the way we understand the world. And when it comes to understanding immigration, most of my colleagues in the United States look through one of 3 lenses: assimilation, transnationalism, or exclusion. Now, assimilation, I think, is familiar to everyone who might be listening, right? It comes out of the Chicago School, but it's really just the common sense, everyday way we might understand immigrant integration. So most assimilation research is based on sort of matching, say, income and education levels from the US born with the immigrant born. And the underlying assumption is that immigrants are assimilating into whiteness, into some middle class suburban ideal. And that's really not the story of immigrant integration that is happening in South LA. Transnationalism, and here, I'll have to do a shout out to anthropologists who really innovated this perspective in the 80s and 90s. Transnationalism looks at the extent to which immigrant life transcends national boundaries, the ways in which social circuits are formed so that a family might continue to be a family or a household across national boundaries. There's social circuits of that circulate. And this may happen for churches, for civic organizations, friendship circles. But I think, as we all know, we have lived through a period of our history recently where the US-Mexico border has become increasingly fortified. Today, 11 million people live in our country. 11 million residents are in our country without full rights, right, of legal rights. And so this has really been a deterrent to living, say, the kind of transnational life that Mexican braceros might have lived in the earlier part of the 20th century. And then more recently, a lot of colleagues are looking at these exclusions, the regimes of deportation, detention, and racial exclusion. None of those frames seemed to work for our project and the stories we were hearing. So our alternative is really looking at immigrant homemaking. How are Latino, and specifically Mexican and Central American immigrants and families finding home? So we're looking at home as material, as emotional, but especially as a process that unfolds over time, and one that is rooted, attached to a particular place. And then as race is a really important part of our study as well. Right? Like, how do we understand Latino homemaking in an historically Black space that has been hard won for African Americans? The traditional framework coming out of, say, Chicago School Sociology, which has very, very long legs and long extension, is to see ethnic secession, to understand, for example, how neighborhoods of Chicago or Baltimore or where have you may have gone from being primarily Italian or Polish neighborhoods to African American neighborhoods to then, Korean immigrant neighborhoods. So the idea with ethnic secession models is one group moves out and another one takes over, a kind of reconquista. That is not the story we see unfolding in South LA. So we use the term racial ethnic sedimentation to better get at an understanding of how Latinos are now the population, the resident majority in South LA. Black people are still there, but African American culture, political traditions, civil rights ideals carry very strong influence. So the idea of sedimentation is kind of the geologic metaphor, right? Even as Black people have diminished, their influence remains very strong, particularly with the second generation. And here, just actually a shout out to a couple of other scholars who helped inform our view of that. One is Wendy Chang, an American Studies scholar at Scripps College, and the other is my colleague and historian Natalia Molina and her notion of relational racialization, which really get at what we find here. Now, how have others looked at race in these kinds of situations? I talked about ethnic secession models. Well, part of why community leaders asked us to do this study is because the dominant narrative that has continued in LA is really a holdover from an earlier era, let's say the 80s, the 90s, one that really focuses on conflict and competition between Latinos and African Americans over wages, over jobs, over resources. In fact, these two groups are hooked up to very, very different kinds of job markets and job experiences, which I'm happy to address later. Others have stressed commonalities, right? Shared racial oppression. Well, part of, we find that, but this develops, as I want to emphasize, over time. It's not as though it falls from the sky. It's not all hunky-dory today. And it certainly was not, a kumbaya type of situation from the get-go. So the temporal dimension is really important to understanding what's happened. The 1980s and the 1990s were really tough times in South LA. This is a great moment in our nation of deindustrialization, right? That means factories and corporate managers made decisions to move production overseas, what had once been good factory jobs and auto industry. There was a big tire plant close to Watts, right in Southgate. These close up, jobs are gone, lack of investment, and you see mounting violence, police violence, gang violence. This is the time of the Crips and the Bloods. And really just a really tough moment. So a lot of Black families who could picked up and left. Where did they go? Many of them went to, well, they went to different places, honestly. That is the full story, but many of them went to what we call the exurbs of Los Angeles, places like Riverside, Santa Clarita, Lancaster, where housing was affordable and where their families could feel safer. More affluent African Americans, professional class African Americans went further west. Baldwin Hills, Leimert Park. If you're from LA, you will recognize those places. And you may know there's also a professional class, kind of a reverse great migration happening right now in our country with professional class African Americans leaving cities like Chicago, as well as Los Angeles, going to Atlanta, or maybe going to Houston, more affordable housing, Las Vegas, again, more affordable. Let's see. So I promised I would share these maps. And if you're from Los Angeles, you will recognize, we kind of navigate by calling out our freeways. So at the top, the horizontal line you see is the 10 freeway, and that extends from, it goes west from Santa Monica and the Pacific Ocean east, quite a ways, but that little kind of quadrant that you see there at the upper right is our little downtown, and the university we work at, USC, is right up there where you see it labeled as University Park. Immediately to the right in that lower quadrant is historic South Central, this neighborhood I've already called out, that is was once really the African-American cultural center of Los Angeles, and is today 90% Latino, although it is represented by an African-American city councilman, Curran Price. Our two other neighborhoods that we focus on are down at the bottom, Watts, which you can see is the furthest southeast of this grid, and then Vermont Square, Vermont Slauson, which doesn't have quite the name recognition and the historic place sense of these two other neighborhoods, but which is a really vibrant center of Black-Brown coalition making. It's also distinguished by having the Latino population here is primarily Central American, because they pretty much moved down from Pico Union and MacArthur Park. So I'm going to go through these slides kind of quickly. The last one was 1970. The dark green shows, the darker green is heavier percentage, larger percentage African American. And you can see 40 years later, it looks like this, with most of these neighborhoods no longer being majority African American. The ones that are further west. Baldwin Hills, which is quite an affluent neighborhood. Leimert Park, a site of a lot of new cultural life. Manchester Square, tougher inner city neighborhood. And then here's sort of the reverse of what this looks like with the Latino population. So, Latinos have always been in Los Angeles. Los Angeles was Mexico, we know, until 1848, and Mexicans were there. And there have been many different waves. But prior to 1965, most Mexicans and Mexican Americans were in East LA, in Boyle Heights, and also out in the San Fernando Valley and San Gabriel Valley, which were agricultural fields, right? The orange, like part of the citrus empire, is how LA came up. And of course, a lot of Mexican migration in this earlier phase is primarily male, more circular, the bracero program, the undocumented braceros who were welcomed with open arms to work. But after 1965, we do see more families, more women, more permanent settlement. 1965 is a big watershed year. And by 2010, we see South LA looking like this, with a majority Latino population primarily moving in from the east side, right? These Huntington Park, these are kind of industrial, we could call these sort of industrial suburbs, right? Pretty dramatic change. Now I'm going to just click through these quickly and try to go to some photographs. So here's a photograph that Walter Thompson Hernandez took, but it's a home where I entered multiple times and conducted interviews with the family and got to know them quite well. I can tell you about the family here. It's a mixed marriage. The husband is Guatemalan. He works as a jeweler. There's a small Latino cottage industry and jewelry making in downtown LA. His wife is now disabled. She's Mexican after working many years at the airport, doing custodial and service work. They have 2 kids, a daughter who's a nurse, a son they're very proud of who's in the military. And I think they express, and I do want to mention they're homeowners. Again, you'll notice this is quite a fortified house, right? Check out the bars on the window, the gates, there's bars around the door. But Latino immigrant homeownership is a part of the story of South LA. And this was the second house they have owned in Watts. They lost the first one with the recession, and were able to manage to buy this one. So the story we have with most of our first generation Latino immigrants is a lot of social distance with their Black neighbors. while at the same time, having neighborly relations, nos saludamos nomás, like we just say hello to one another. There's a deeper story of Black parental mentorship that also goes on. But, I want to call attention. This first generation of Mexican and Central American immigrants are, for the most part, monolingual. Most of their African American neighbors are monolingual in another language. And many Mexican and Central American immigrants enter the United States having internalized US racial hierarchies and really having had a sense of European white supremacy also inculcated from their countries, where being Spanish, being white, being of Spanish descendancy is seen, it's a slightly different racial hierarchy than the US, but nevertheless, whiteness is generally seen as the top. And then finally, I want to mention, remind you what I was saying about the 80s and the 90s in South LA. This was a time of a lot of violence. I interviewed many now older Latina immigrant women who recalled being at bus stops wearing their gold crosses and their gold medallions and having those yanked right off their necks, being mugged. And actually, the gentleman who lives at this house, I'll just call him Juan, told me of waking up one night to find that his gardening equipment was being stolen out of his garage. And the story, as he told me, was that he jumped out of bed wearing his underwear and grabbed the machete that he keeps under his bed for self-protection, went after these burglars and got his equipment back. So part of the story there is over-policing is part of the story of South LA. And we might also say under-policing is part of what first generation Latino residents have gone through as well, not feeling protected or responded to by local civic authorities or by the police, and taking things into their own hands. Another beautiful photo taken by Walter Thompson Hernandez. In this family, this is another interestingly mixed family. The dad is Guatemalan, the mother is Salvadoran. And in this case, I interviewed on separate occasions both this daughter, there's another sister, and the mother. The really interesting, I'm not going to follow the text that I've written on the side of this slide, but I think I'm going to tell you the story of this family according to those different categories that I have there. So part of feeling at home is feeling like you're secure, that you're protected. And part of what Latino residents went about doing as soon as they moved to South LA in the 80s and 90s was putting up fences, multiple locks, these porch cages that I've described. So the strategy, as we call it, is basically a lot of shutting in and shutting out, home to work. Driving out or busing out to go to church. There were not yet many Catholic churches there. Going to marquetas in other places. On Sundays, if they went to a park, they would drive out to go to a park elsewhere. And they went about getting familiarity and really learning the neighborhood over time. And this required very elaborate spatial mobility strategies. So one of the parks I studied in depth, Martin Luther King Park, is now a beautiful, vibrant park, there's a whole political process. It's a shared space for both African Americans and Latinos. It's a shared space for drug dealers, for there's a lot of open street prostitution, there's gang life, but there's also playgrounds, a beautiful library, soccer games, etc. However, when this young woman was growing up, it was pretty tough Crip territory. So her parents she told me her parents still do not want her walking through that park, right? Very, very strict rules about this. So the home becomes a really important site, right? The home as a haven, a place where many Latinos, immigrants of the first generation that I interviewed, told me they felt a greater sense of freedom there. Before, maybe they had lived in Boyle Heights, maybe they had lived in small substandard apartments in downtown LA where, they worked tough jobs and you couldn't play your music loud, right? There was no driveway for you to go out and work on your car. So there's a kind of what I discuss as a sort of ranchofication process happening in South LA with, growing tropical fruit trees, sometimes having animals that are not cats or dogs in the yards, chickens. I've even seen ponies in South LA and Watts, which was a great surprise to me. And part of the home is making a future. Having a home is a place where you try to project yourself and your family into the future. And I'm just going to go back to this photo right here. So this señora was one of these, I'm going to push my daughters. I want them to learn English. Every year when they were put into bilingual classes, she would go to school. She would argue with the school principal. She would say, I want them in only English, which meant they were the only, at that point, non-African American kids in the class. So it was really this interdependence and reliance on Black parental mentorship, African-American teachers, African-American friendships that help propel this next generation into the future. And then to come full circle, this young woman who you see here was a star pupil who went on to graduate from the University of Pennsylvania, attended the Wharton School of Business, discovered business is not where it's at for her, not where her heart is. And she returned to South LA to work as a 7th grade math teacher. She runs a side business doing tax preparation and tutoring. And now she too is a homeowner in South LA, just like her parents. I don't want to go on with text, and we're kind of going through, here's some more photographs. So a big part of the story, as I mentioned earlier, is a new kind of Latinidad, which doesn't mean racial identity is not important, but racial identity is really shaped by place and by quotidian relationships that people have had over their lifetime. So the second generation who's come up in South LA has, is fully bilingual, fully bicultural, has, totally proud to have come up in, the heart of West Coast hip hop and rap, had Black boyfriends and girlfriends, played on sports teams. As I said, it wasn't all kumbaya. Many of the second generation that we interviewed went through times of where there was a lot of racial violence, these kind of race riots in the high schools. But unlike their parents, they have really adopted this strong affinity with African Americans. And a surprise finding for us was the number of them who kind of disassociated themselves and criticized their cousins in East LA or other parts of LA who they see as overly anti-Black racist and overly nationalistic. Another part of second generation coming up in South LA is this real love and pride of place. I believe because of our interview, our research assistants, we oversampled a highly educated group of second generation Latino residents, which is to say many of them were in college or had gone to college, like the woman I mentioned who'd gone to Penn. But one of the surprises was many of them are coming back and want to be working as community organizers, as drug counselors, as teachers who are really focused on this uplift. We might call it racial uplift or community uplift. So this is a big pattern. My colleague Jody Vallejo has found this with a lot of kids raised by Mexican immigrant parents who realize the sacrifice their parents made and want to give back to their families. But here it's a collective give back. And this young woman is saying here in the quote we're featuring, she wants her kids now to hope they realize they do their part. Let us see where more photos. Again, this deep sense of love and pride of place, very significant. I think we've got about 12 minutes left here. I don't know that my video camera can work, but I'm going to stop my share screen and hope we can have a dialogue. Does that sound good?
That sounds great, Pierrette. Can you try to reactivate your screen?
I'm going to try once more.
Okay.
So there's integrated web camera. I'm very sorry, Paul, and I'm very sorry to everybody. I really am a real person here. I got out of my exercise clothes to make an appearance here, and all you can see is this black screen. But I can see the question and answers here. So how about if, Paul, do you want to pick them out, or shall I just read through them?
Sure, we can take turns. I know we had your screen working earlier when we were testing it, so that's too bad. But you know what? We'll just roll with it.
Yeah,
as we do when we're teaching, and that's if you figure it out, and that would be fun for everyone to see you there. And
these are great,
let's start.
Great questions. Michael Olivas asked, was my book an SAR project? And yes, Michael, I was really excited the day I got my SAR acceptance, and I worked through reading these transcripts at my beautiful little office, looking at that beautiful apricot tree. So very happy to have had my writing time sponsored. And I mean, here we could talk a little bit about the time it takes to do qualitative analysis. It's storytelling, but really, to try to get at the whole story, you really have to understand the whole gestalt of it. And initially, back in LA, we used a qualitative software program called Deduce, and we had a great team effort. We had big meetings around a seminar table to come up with all of these codes, but they were meaningless to me. I really needed to have a year to sit and read, even though one of my colleagues ribbed me about having to go to beautiful Santa Fe to write about South LA, but that's what it took. Let's see, the next question is, has there been any move back to original spots, or do people tend to stay once they've moved to a new place? Well, this is a really good question. We find a lot of commitment, as I said, the strong love and pride of place among the second generation who've come back. But I will tell you, like, if we want to poke holes at my research or find like a little spot, it would be really interesting if we had the resources or somebody else wanted to do this and find those who left South LA. In fact, if we had had the resources, interesting or a whole other book would be interviewing African Americans who've left South LA and who've gone to many of these other communities that I've mentioned. We did do a shorter sample of 25 interviews with residents in Watts, mostly women. And these were, there's a strong sense of Black loss, or what I would call melancholy, about the loss of having these historic African-American communities and institutions. And what I found by hanging out at the parks and the gardens were African Americans who now may live in the San Fernando Valley or have gone further west, who might return to South LA on Sunday for church service, or to go to the drum circle, which one man described to me, a 55-year-old African-American man who rides his motorcycle from San Fernando Valley. It's like a religious experience coming back to South LA. So still kind of a sacred space. As I mentioned, there were a lot of reasons African Americans left, and let's not forget the whole reason we had African American segregated community was redlining, legal segregation, a really kind of policed and enforced apartheid that is gone. So it's kind of a mixed bag. Next question. From an anonymous attendee is, it's interesting from the outside, everyone is seen as Latino, but you say that it's a mixed marriage. Can you speak to that? Yeah, I just started using that because I realized some of the photographs I was seeing of those that I've interviewed, I have, one Central American parent, one Mexican parent. The more interesting mixed marriage that is occurring, of course, is between African Americans and Latinos. As I said, I guess one of the limitations, we did all of the statistical data, we did 200 interviews, some ethnography, but I will call out here the work of Walter Thompson Hernandez, one of our key interviewers, and now the author of his own book, Compton Cowboys. And Walter identifies as a Blaxican. He's got an African-American father and a Chicana mother. And he has done beautiful, if you look him up, you can see his work. He's got a beautiful website. He's got beautiful journalistic work. He's done this in Europe as well as here in South LA, looking at these biracial or new racial categories, which, as you know, if you're following along with the census data that came out in 2020, that's many people, more and more people are choosing that. So not a group we focused on, but I think I'll take this opportunity to tell a short story about a Salvadoran woman I interviewed. She must have been about 60 when I interviewed her. And part of my job going around to interview people is to ask, we had interview protocols, the same questions were asked of the same group of people. And as I asked her about her relationships with African Americans, especially in that earlier period when she had moved to South LA, all I heard were extremely negative stories, right? They moved next door to a crack house. It made her life miserable. She felt the African-American teacher was unfair to her kids at school. She thought the Black mothers were making fun of her lupus marks on her face. She even blamed a Black medical technician for her losing a pregnancy. And it was like one negative thing after another. But then as we spoke, it was revealed, she told me about how she had cried for 3 days when her daughter revealed in high school that she had a Black boyfriend. She cried for 3 days. And then now that Black boyfriend is her son-in-law. He lives there at home with her, and she had nothing but, love and accolades to say about him. And her granddaughter, who is, is a Black little girl who sleeps with her grandmother now. So there's this process of racial change that is happening at this very intimate sphere, some of it through mixed marriages and embracing African Americans within the family. And our final question here is, what does the future hold in terms of the next place to live? Do you see integration into white neighborhoods? That's a good question. And let me look into my crystal ball here. As a sociologist, I think it's hard enough for me to make declarations or proclamations about what is happening now. That's about as far as I can go. But I will tell you this. As I suggested, real estate is part of the story, a big story that's unfolding in LA and all of our coastal cities that have unconscious, just ridiculously high levels of rent and real estate prices. Do I see integration into white neighborhoods? What I see happening in South LA is this deep commitment. People want to stay there. Black people and brown people who are there want to hold on to their homes, want to hold on to their community life. But new metro rails have come in. The university that I work for, USC, is its own big real estate empire that has, made lots of incursions within South LA. There's these huge new luxury apartments with sort of Italianate names where students pay lots of money to live that are changing the neighborhood. Are they changing the neighborhood for better or for worse? It depends on who you ask. Some of the Latino residents.
Pierrette, I can't hear you. Pierrette, I'm sorry we have lost you. I will call it a day now. And thank you everyone for joining us. Take care and check out the book.